Student rights. Students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse door. School officials accept a weighty responsibility as they try to preserve school safety and at the same time protect the constitutional rights of the students. Clearly, the safety issues continue to be a necessary but critical policy concern. Because the Constitution of the United States is considered the basic law of the land, many school rules, policies, and laws have been established based on its framework. Several amendments to the Constitution and significant legal cases examined and tried throughout history are particularly important in regards to the rights of students and school personnel. The First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and the 14th Amendment are particularly important in education because they each address specific rights that are frequently challenged in an educational setting. Most recent developments, such as zero-tolerance policies, should also be examined when considering administrative duties within the school. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution addresses the basic personal freedoms of students and school personnel involving speech, press, assembly, and religion. School officials often have to consider this question: when do the protections of a student's First Amendment rights interfere with the rights of other students to feel safe in a school setting? One of the most significant factors improving school officials and students' understanding of their responsibilities in consideration of the First Amendment was due to the outcome of 1965 Tinker v. Des Moines Independent School Community School District case. In Tinker, students wore black armbands as a protest to the Vietnam War and were subsequently suspended for their actions. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the protest, explaining that because there were no signs of undifferentiated fear or apprehension of disturbance in connection to the protest, then there was not anything substantial enough to overcome the right of freedom of expression. It is important to know that this case does not pave the way for students to express themselves freely in ways that would be disruptive or pose any danger in the school, nor does it inhibit educators from preventing these types of protests if they foresee it as a problem in enforcing a safe educational environment. Tinker not only established the freedom for students to exercise their First Amendment rights, but it also provided school officials clearer guidelines to govern within school settings. Although the laws have been improved, tougher decisions are on the horizons for the Supreme Court. Issues regarding off-campus speech are a growing concern as the use of technologies such as personal websites, social networking sites, blogs, instant messaging, and other new technologies are increasing. For the most part, courts have relied on the Tinker's material and substantial disruption standards in ruling that school officials must produce evidence to substantiate that off-campus expression results in on-campus disruption. The Fourth Amendment is another constitutional right that should be considered within a school setting, as it addresses rights to privacy and protects students and school personnel from unreasonable intrusion into their person or property. As part of the Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment guards against unreasonable searches and seizures, and shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched, and the persons or things to be seized. Understandably, school officials have a dilemma when it is their responsibility to preserve school safety free of violence, illegal drugs, and alcohol. It is challenging, to say the least, to confiscate weapons and illegal substances while adhering to Fourth Amendment rights. In 1985, the Supreme Court recognized this dilemma when confronted with the New Jersey versus TLO case. In this case, the teacher at Piscataway High School in Middlesex County, New Jersey, found TLO and one of her friends smoking in a restroom. Because the restroom was clearly a non-smoking area, the principal called the two in the office. Even though TLO denied smoking in the bathroom or even smoking at all, eventually the admission of her friend from the restroom incident instigated a search of TLO's purse. Contrary to TLO's denial, her purse exposed guilt, as a pack of cigarettes, rolling papers, a pipe, marijuana, a large bundle of dollar bills, and a couple of letters suggesting her involvement in drug dealing at the school were found. It wasn't until she was taken to the police station that she confessed that she had indeed sold marijuana at the store. Although TLO was sentenced probation for a year by a juvenile court, The state Supreme Court overturned the decision, stating that TLO's Fourth Amendment rights had been violated. The state of New Jersey asked that the Supreme Court hear its appeal. Finally, the Supreme Court, in upholding the school administrator, did not require that the search be based on the higher standard of probable cause necessary for obtaining a search warrant. Ultimately, the courts have recognized that school officials have a responsibility to maintain the discipline necessary for education, and the rights of children and adolescents are not the same as those of adults. So it is only necessary for school officials to consider a certain level of suspicion of illicit activity to justify a search. The court's rationale was that requiring the same probable cause as a police officer would unjustifiably interfere with the maintenance of the swift and informal disciplinary procedures needed in the schools. Thus, the court struck a balance between the pupils' legitimate expectations of privacy and the needs of the school to preserve a proper learning environment. The 14th Amendment is equally important to students' rights, as it supports no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. This is significant in a school setting because it addresses the due process rights of students and school personnel to ensure that equal protection under the law and fundamental fairness occur in matters involving deprivation of liberty and property. Procedural due process for students resulted initially from the civil rights movement after the 1960 Dixon versus Alabama State Board of Education. But laws were significantly refined for juveniles after the Goss versus Lopez case. In Columbus, Ohio, Lopez and 8 other students were suspended from school for 10 days for misconduct and for destroying school property. Because the students were not given a hearing before they were suspended, Principal Goff's actions were argued against, and the courts found that the students' rights for due process of law were violated. Because of this case, the Supreme Court ruled that the suspensions require procedural due process, even in the case of a short-term suspension. This case also initiated the component of the law that states that before students are suspended, they have a constitutional right to be notified in writing or orally of any charges against them, given an opportunity to challenge any of the charges, and given an explanation of the evidence that supports those charges. Simply stated, any suspension from school requires the due process but does not require the same degree of deliberation as an expulsion. Unlike the more formal procedures required in expulsion, this process can be simply a give and take between the disciplinarian and the student. In order to ensure that schools are safer, the passage of the Federal Gun-Free Schools Act by Congress in 1994 was enacted. This act required all states to pass legislation mandating a one-year expulsion for any student found carrying firearms on school property, and also required referral to the local criminal or juvenile justice system. Soon afterwards, the United States Department of Education officially defined these zero-tolerance policies as policies that mandate predetermined consequences or punishment for specific offenses. Zero-tolerance policies are a response to an environment where parents are quick to defend their children and quick to sue the children's antagonist in the form of school officials representing the establishment. While some school officials agree that the ability to maintain a safer school environment is a direct result of the zero-tolerance policies, others argue the policies are excessive, misinterpreted, and ineffective. The intent of the Act was a worthwhile attempt to secure school safety. However, the problem has been that the Gun-Free Schools Act has been misinterpreted by many school administrators so that they tend to expand the scope of the legitimate school expulsions under the Act. Unfortunately, when the Act serves to go beyond firearm possession and instead enforces infractions such as drug possession, tobacco-related offenses, and behaviors that fall loosely under the category of school disruption, then the Act fosters impractical purposes. Furthermore, it is a common sentiment that employing a blanket policy of expulsion, clearly a serious penalty, precludes the use of independent consideration of relevant facts and circumstances. Furthermore, one would recognize that because no two situations are ever alike, the essence of due process is challenged. An effective administrator should be thoroughly familiar with the laws associated with students' rights to ensure the protections of those rights. Students' rights are not solely for the benefit of the students, but they are also put in place as protective measures for school administrators. Without a doubt, the laws that protect students are important to parents, but they are also essential for students themselves to know and understand. What purpose are the laws if those whom they are intended to serve are not aware of them? An administrator who is aware of the law and who remains prudent and reasonable will also effectively maintain the balance between student rights and school safety.